Okay, folks, about a week or two ago, I put out a video on Identity Crisis number 1. Now, that video was particularly technical, talking about the technique of using a countdown in your books, where it can be more of a distraction than a enhancement to the story. But I didn't talk about the elephant in the room, which was the rape of Sue Dibny. Now, that, of course, is the major feature of Identity Crisis that made it a controversial comic book series even at the time. And I didn't address that because, well, for one thing, I hadn't gotten yet to Identity Crisis number 2, which is where the rape scene takes place. But I wanted to kind of leave that for later so that by the end of the series, I could really comment on how that fit into the series as a whole, because there are people who protested at the time, and who still protest even today, that it was wrong of Brad Meltzer to have included that terrible scene in this book. And I'm trying to think of whether or not he could have done anything other than what he did, given where the story was going. So if you have not read Identity Crisis, and you're going to watch this video, I would recommend that you go ahead and read it, because there are a lot of revelations that I'm going to be talking about, and some of those revelations are going to give the game away on some major secrets of the book, and I don't want that to be spoiled for you if you've never read this before. So read with caution, especially if you're sensitive to sexual assault and the literature that you're reading, but at the same time, I would recommend you go ahead and give it a try. It definitely helps if you are well-versed in the DC universe and know the names of characters, like the identities of characters, like Flash being Barry Allen, Robin being Tim Drake at the time. You've got Dick Grayson and as Nightwing, etc., etc. If you know the names of the heroes as well as the as well as their superhero identities, that's going to carry you a long way. And I know that because I actually gave this series as a gift to a couple of my friends, and they told me later that they were kind of confused at the fact that people kept referring to each other by first names, and they didn't know which first names corresponded with which heroes. Okay, well, yeah, I didn't realize that. So anyway, I'm going to give you the spoiler warning, spoiler countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and now from here on there will be spoilers. So the basic gist of Identity Crisis has to do with the fact that superheroes keep their identities concealed. And what happens if somebody who knows the superheroes' identities actually takes advantage of that fact and starts acting against the superheroes' families? Now, the first superhero who suffers a loss is Ralph Dibny. His wife is murdered in the first issue of the book. Now, he is an open superhero. He does not conceal his identity behind a mask. And so he and his wife are known to the general public. And whereas the rest of the superheroes, of course, have their own secret identities for the most part. Now, when his wife is murdered, that sets off a triggering chain of events, because all of a sudden you've got this little particular subset of the Justice League, him included, going after Dr. Light, who is the villain they suspect of murdering the elongated man's wife, Sue Dibny. And the reason they suspect him of that is because years ago, he raped Sue Dibny, and on top of that, they did something to him. The Justice League did something to him specifically on account of that. Now, the question that I get asked, or at least the question that I got asked by somebody with whom I apparently had interacted 20 years ago and defended the series at the time, basically said, this was a terrible thing, this rape was a terrible thing to include in this woman's character history, and it was a terrible thing to have depicted in a DC comic book? And why did he even have to go down this route at all? And those are good questions, because when you're doing these things to the story, I mean, granted, one of the things that you're going to do if you're a writer is you're going to take characters who are good people and you're going to subject them to terrible treatment. Because that's what you need in order to have any sort of tension in a story. You have to have bad things usually happening to good people, and then have those good people find some way to bring goodness back to the forefront. Excuse me. So what? But why rape in this case? Why would Brad Meltzer go to that extent? And I had to think of it for a while, about that for a while. And it really has to do a lot with what the heroes did to Dr. Light on account of that rape. Because when they found out what he had done, they took him and they did something to him that they had done to other supervillains in the past, but to a much larger degree. And here's where the whole identity thing really comes into play. There were plenty of times in the Justice League's history where the Justice League would wind up having their identities exposed on account of, say, villains taking over their bodies or villains taking over their minds. And when that happened, it was usually up to a kind of cleanup crew of certain superheroes to keep the villains restrained and then wipe their memories of these identities so that they would not remember the superheroes' identities and they would not be able to use that information against superheroes in the future. So you had this cleanup crew consisting of about 7 or so superheroes. You had like Hawkman, Green Arrow, Black Canary, Green Lantern, who else? Elongated Man, and I'm the Flash. And I'm probably leaving 1 or 2 out. But the basic idea is that once the battle was over and the villains were, captured and the heroes could go off on their merry way, these heroes would stay behind, and Zatanna, I left her out, but she's the core player in this. Zatanna would use her magic powers. She has the power of being able to magically affect the world by speaking backwards talk. She would wipe their memory. She would wipe the memories of the villains who had gained knowledge of the heroes' identities. And this was just kind of standard practice. It was just something that, not all the heroes who went on their merry way knew about, but this particular cadre of heroes who were the cleanup crew would stay behind and do the dirty work of erasing the villains' memories of the heroes' identities so that they could all go back to superheroing and not have to worry about these villains attacking them in their places of normal business or attacking their families, even worse. Well, with Dr. Light, they went farther than that. They didn't just tamper with his memories, but because he had committed such a horrific act against Sue Dibny as to rape her, they went farther than they normally would have, and they actually altered his personality. And from that point on, Dr. Light wound up kind of appearing as sort of a goofball character in comics. And so I think part of what Brad Meltzer was doing in Identity Crisis was kind of giving an explanation for why Dr. Light was kind of a serious character when he was first originally introduced, and then later on became kind of a goofball who would often be defeated by the Teen Titans of all people, and never really be the same serious villain that he was. It was because the Justice League had tampered with his mind and caused him to be this goofy villain type character, as opposed to the more, well, I guess you could actually call him legitimately rapacious character that he started off as. It had to be something that serious. It had to be a crime against one of the Justice League's families, and it had to be something so serious that they had to take extraordinary measures. And a simple assault would not necessarily have done that. And here's the other thing. I mean, somebody might argue that, well, why is it that Dr. Light just didn't beat the hell out of her? And there's actually a really good reason for that. And it's a reason that came up in Brian Michael Bendis' arc in New Avengers. I don't know if you've read that arc in New Avengers. It's a good arc. I mean, I'll do a little bit of minor spoilers, but basically there is a female Avenger who is kidnapped by a group of villains, and she is publicly beaten half to death while being recorded. And her beating takes place in the comic right in front of us. She is punched, she is savaged, she's not sexually assaulted, but she is pummeled within an inch of her life in front of the camera, and we see it all. And Brian Michael Bendis was taken to task for having put this into the arc of New Avengers, and when he was asked about that, he said, I had to show it all. I had to have all of it placed on screen, because if I didn't, then people would always assume that there was some sort of sexual assault. Because it was a female character and because you had all these male characters involved, it would be assumed, if I left anything to the imagination, that sexual assault would be part of the imagination that people would bring to the table. And so, in Brad Meltzer's case, when he's writing this sequence for Identity Crisis, and he has to come up with something that is not only so traumatic, it can't kill the character, for one thing, but it has to be something so brutal that these heroes would have their morality challenged to the extent that they would be willing not only to wipe somebody's memory of something having happened, but actually to tamper with the personality and identity of a person. To actually change that person's mind and erase who that person was, and hopefully leave someone less threatening in its place. That is the kind of proactive stuff that we usually see in things like Squadron Supreme or the series Injustice. And this was one of those things where the Justice League really crossed a moral threshold, but felt that they had to, due to the severity of the crime against Sue. And because of that, there had to be that kind of strong triggering event. So, but what could Brad Meltzer do? Because here's the thing: if all he had done was suggest a beating, then he would have had to do the same thing that Brian Bendis did in order to make it not rape. It was either going to be, so he was kind of damned if he do, damned if he didn't. And the damned if you do part is he would have had to do what Brian Michael Bendis had done. He would have had to have Dr. Light beat Sue Dibny right in front of us for pages and pages, which is how long it went on in New Avengers. It was pages long, several pages long. Now with Brian Michael Bendis, you can do that because he can't do freaking anything without taking 5 comic books to do it. But Brad Meltzer knows how to write, at least, in terms of efficiency. And he needs a scene that's going to be over and done with in a page. That's not going to happen if he has to show, blow by blow, everything that happens to Sue Dibny in the course of this beating that she would receive. But if he left anything out of it, what's going to happen? Well, people are going to assume that there was some sort of sexual assault that took place. Well, the only real solution is to cut out the middleman and just basically say, yes, a sexual assault did take place, and we're going to have to show that that's what took place. But the saving grace of that is that we're able to show it in a few panels as opposed to having to show a brutal act taking several pages. And so I would submit that to have to have a act of violence perpetrated on this character, it was going to have to be this act of sexual violence. Or else it was going to be an act of violence so long and drawn out that the horror of it was going to be possibly even more of a lasting impression on readers for having to be exposed to the blow-by-blow content of it. So I would say that that Brad Meltzer really didn't have much choice other than to include this rape scene in the book. Now, one of the things that I was told was horrible about Identity Crisis, in addition to the rape scene being in there, was that the rape is never explored from a female perspective. You don't get into the head of Black Canary, for example. You don't get into the head of, maybe... Well, actually, do we get into the head of Barbara Gordon? Or was that something that, God, I've already forgotten from my reading of it. You don't really get into the head of the female characters in the book about the rape of Sue Dibny. Why is that? Well, the thing is that the rape, while being a triggering event in the book, and no pun intended, it's not the point of the book. It's not the be-all, end-all of the book. The be-all, end-all of the book is not that Sue Dibny got raped, or even what happens to her later. The be-all, end-all is that jump of the Justice League across this moral threshold that would have so much consequence in later years. Because I don't think I'm going to have to spoil anything else, but I will say that that wasn't the only compromise that they made in the pursuit of keeping everything under wraps. You'll have to read the book to find out what I mean there. The issue was not that Sue got raped. It was what the heroes did to restore the status quo, and the compromises, the moral compromises that they made in order to restore the status quo, and to see how that would play out in later years. That was the point of the book. And to have any of the female characters start dwelling upon the rape, I mean, obviously, I don't think you could have a female character who started thinking about Sue's rape and then thinking, well, what if that had happened to me? And I think that is largely the reason why we never got into, for example, Black Canary's head, even though she was part of that cadre. We never got into Zatanna's head, thinking about that, because otherwise we would have had to dwell on the rape itself for far longer than it was ever intended that we dwell on it. And that would not have served the book's purpose. The book's purpose was to talk about moral compromise within the Justice League. It was not to talk about this one terrible act that happened against one of the League's family. So I think that Brad Meltzer was additionally justified in not going into any of the female perspectives surrounding this particular event. There are some people who are saying that, this is not the kind of story that can be told today, and I wonder if that's true. I wonder if that's true, that you could not tell a story like Identity Crisis today on account of what happens to Sue Dibny and the kind of way in which it is treated. Can you write an Identity Crisis story in a post-Me Too world? I would go so far to say that if you couldn't, then that's a tragedy. Because Identity Crisis overall is a good story. And I don't want people to... I would hate to think that people are going to condemn it out of hand just for the sake of the fact that it contains this terrible act of violence against a woman. We have so many comics out there where the men get traumatized in various ways, like all the time. And I mean, you should see like some of the stuff that Spider-Man gets put through. But to have to hold back in this respect from being able to tell the kind of tale of moral compromise that Brad Meltzer was able to tell in this 7-issue series, to say that we can't do that anymore, I really feel like every time we come to that kind of juncture in history where our storytelling becomes more and more limited because we cannot bring ourselves to violate the feelings of a sensitive few, we don't improve as a creative species when that happens. So I would go so far as to say I'm glad that Identity Crisis came out when it did, when it was still possible to, because that is what led to Countdown to Infinite Crisis and to Infinite Crisis, which just totally, changed the whole ball game for the DC universe and led us into the 52-week series 52, and then into kind of the capstone series Booster Gold from Jeff Johns on top of that, and also into the Black Adam series, which came out of 52, which, there's so much. There is so much richness that came out of that original story by Brad Meltzer and Rags Morales that I would consider it a tragedy today if that story could not be told today. And so I hope that people are able to still look back on this story and judge it appropriately for what it was able to accomplish within DC Comics at the time. So yeah, my opinion of the story overall is that, because I know the secrets and the revelations that are contained in the story, I know, what happens in advance. I can never go back to the point where I don't know now what I didn't know then. And that makes it a lesser story to read, because revelation was a huge part of the experience of reading Identity Crisis, which is why I hope those of you who have not read the book yet don't have their sense of wonder diminished in that, I've revealed a few things in the book. I hope you do take the chance to check it out and see how it works for yourself, because it does get pretty amazing towards the end. I'll tell you that much. I think I'll go ahead and quit there. I probably talked long enough. Aside from that, yeah. I defended the book then. I still defend the book today. My opinion is largely unchanged. And other than that, I will talk to you all later. I'm Mike Partika. Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe, and also hit me up on Gab, where you can find me on that as a social media forum. And beyond that, I got nothing more to say. I'll talk to you all later.